Hello and welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the celebrations over morning tea. Our next keynote speaker needs almost no introduction, as he's been on our television screens for almost every day for the past year, except for when he resigned. When he took a short break, revealing his very personal experience of the pain, pressure and progress through the COVID-19 pandemic. I am pleased to welcome Professor Brett Sutton, Victoria's Chief Health Officer.
Thank you so much and good morning everyone. Thanks very much Safer Care Victoria for this terrific opportunity to speak at Giant Steps this year. It's a bit funny being in a room with cameras but no aggressive journalists, but we'll see how we go. I understand there's a selfie competition, so I'm going to start with a selfie because I want to be in on the action. So here I am. Oh, I better get the sign in. There we go. So the competition is on. I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the land on which I'm standing, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any Indigenous Australians listening today. So pain, pressure and progress. Maybe no surprises in that title. Next slide. I do want to talk about the journey that we as Victoria in particular have gone through, and there's no question that pain has been a significant part of that. We really have experienced a kind of collective trauma in Victoria, but it is a story of ultimate success, I think. But there's a real importance in acknowledging how difficult it's been, not about me personally, although I want to reflect on some things that I've gone through, but for us collectively as all Victorians, but in the health sector in particular, being really at the pointy end of the response and having gone through such individual and collective challenges in caring for Victorians really under the threat of a very dangerous virus in COVID-19. So the story for me really began very early in January when I was reading a ProMed Mail email that came into my inbox that talked about a respiratory illness that was circulating in Wuhan, in Hubei province in China. It had those alarm bells that you read in ProMed Mail from time to time, which talked about a severe respiratory illness and talked about a cluster of individuals who were suffering from it. So it kind of had the beginnings of that human-to-human transmission with a significant illness that seems to be passed on as a respiratory illness. That had red flags. Next slide. So I think it was January 10 when I came out with a Chief Health Officer alert for clinicians about that particular issue and to look out for respiratory illness. But the more, every day, the more we understood through January, the more concerning it was. We obviously had the experience of SARS as not a pandemic, but as an epidemic that lasted 7 months with over 8,000 cases, 800 deaths, a 10% mortality rate that if it had become a pandemic would have been absolutely devastating. But even with SARS-CoV-2, as it was emerging with a kind of 1% mortality, that was hugely concerning because that was in the vicinity of Spanish flu, and that had been the worst pandemic, as we know, for over 100 years. So the modelling from Melbourne University in the early days was really concerning. So it was flagging based on some assumptions about that reproduction number, how many people one infectious individual would, or one case would infect. And it showed that there was the potential for 58,000 infections a day at the peak of the epidemic. Now that was all on the basis that it would be unmitigated. Now that never plays out, not only because a government will always respond and the health sector will always respond, but because we as individuals will respond. If we see hospitals filling up, if we see our friends, families and loved ones becoming unwell, we'll modify our behaviour in terms of physical distancing, isolation, quarantine and so on. But we needed to know what it would look like if we did nothing. 10,000 intensive care beds at the peak, 7,000 ventilated ICU beds being a requirement at the peak, was way more than our health system could cope with. Next slide. And the biggest tragedy that we had to avoid was the possibility of 650 deaths per day at the peak. Again, on a per capita basis, that hasn't played out really anywhere in the world, but we have seen huge death tolls in countries where the mitigations have been inadequate. 300,000 deaths in Brazil, 500,000 in the United States, 150,000 in the United Kingdom. And that's with measures of varying intensity, of varying success, but still profoundly tragic for those countries. And for Victoria, 820 deaths has been our tragedy. And I'd like to acknowledge that terrible fact for Victoria. It's weighed on me right through this. That's part of my personal pain. And again, not about me. It's me reflecting on 820 families who've lost loved ones and the pain that they've gone through. And so those modelling scenarios were a wake-up call for me, a wake-up call for Cabinet and really across Australia to prepare ourselves and to make sure that we could respond. Next slide. The actual epidemic curve shows what played out in Victoria. So there was a first wave, obviously, that we were all responding to as states and territories. That peaked at about 100 cases a day in March and April for Victoria. As we all know, that got down to even a day in June with 0 cases, but we suffered a second wave. And the response to that, collectively, has been both the tragedy and the triumph. The tragedy because most of the deaths in Victoria happened during that second wave, and the triumph because ultimately we got through it and we drove community transmission back down to nothing. That was fantastic for Victoria. It's fantastic for Australia. It's meant so much for us that we can have the last 6 months with no deaths in Victoria, with no real significant community transmission. Next slide, please. But we've suffered 20,000 plus cases of COVID-19. There were 2,494 hospitalised at any point in the epidemic. 330 required ICU and 151 ventilation. So really significant pressures, and that's with a really significant response. And so you don't need to be too imaginative to recognise how it might have been for Victoria. And that was really a driving focus for me, understanding, because it was already playing out across the world, what it would mean if we couldn't get down to 0 community transmission, what a rolling lockdown would look like as cases rose again and we faced another wave and another wave and another wave. And this was all at a point where I was making decisions, Cabinet was engaged in all of those debates, what it would mean for us if no vaccine prospects were likely. As it turned out, we've got a vaccine within 12 months, but that's a world record. In the history of vaccine development, you'll never see a vaccine that's ready to go from the time that a disease is identified within 12 months. That has been a scientific triumph for the world, and it's still tricky. We're still struggling with supply. We're still struggling with variants that have some immune escape and so on. But not to have to wait 20 years for a vaccine has made such a difference, because that would have meant 20 years of a really significant illness rolling through in waves and killing tens of thousands of people. Next slide. And most of the cases were in young people, but the numbers in our elderly population were not insignificant. Next slide. And the deaths that occurred were very much in those who were over 65 years of age, and that mortality increased the older that any individual was. So for those who are 80 plus, a very, very severe illness, and for those in aged care, and this is where the tragedy really unfolded in Victoria, 1 in 3 infected died. So it was a systems issue, and it was obviously an issue of uncontrolled transmission in the community that we needed to get on top of to manage that. And then healthcare worker infections, another tragedy within a tragedy in Victoria. 3,561 healthcare workers infected, the great majority in healthcare settings. That was not the case in the first wave, but it was absolutely the case in the second wave. And we've gone through a process of understanding just how significant that was and exactly what we've needed to do. I hope that we continue to learn the lessons from that. It's clear that there has been a contested space around transmission, and we need to be open to new science, new data, new empirical evidence around everything to do with this virus, including transmission and how to protect ourselves. And the reflections and the lessons from the second wave in Victoria in particular, and what happened in healthcare settings is a really powerful one. And I think Victoria's well on the way to embedding those lessons for now and into the future. Next slide. So those are the cases in healthcare workers, and they really were an increase that happened in parallel to community transmission. People were coming into hospital, especially from aged care, and that surge in admissions into our hospital system led to a surge in cases in healthcare workers. And we now know that there are multiple mitigations that need to be in place to protect healthcare workers. An appropriate focus on PPE has absolutely been part of the debate and part of what's been raised up, but the system elements, all of the slices of Swiss cheese, and I've got a slide on that, need to be in place. Next slide. And so these are the deaths that have occurred. The tragedy in those 80, 90 plus years of age, but understanding that young people, when you've got huge numbers of cases, are obviously also at risk, and we've seen it with variants of concern in Brazil. We've seen young people in other countries when you've got huge case numbers. Next slide. And, you know, I have reflected on the fact that Singapore had more cases than Victoria, but only 30 deaths. Now, part of that will be the way that they look after their elderly, but also the system elements that they've got to protect those in aged care. We need to learn all of those lessons. It's about those structural and system issues that need to be made right to protect the elderly in those settings, in the same way that we're talking about protecting healthcare workers in their work settings. Next slide. The pressure. Next slide. So there were always these corollaries of what significant transmission in Victoria would mean. There were job losses. Next slide. Really significant effects on mental health. We know that there was a surge in demand for mental health services. As it happened, the suicide rate was not above a recent historical average. That said, any suicide is a tragedy, and the pressures were manifest in individuals with the surge in demand for services, and we know that that continues. So it's not a case of transmission over mental health effects no longer at play. They absolutely are, and we need to be focused on the care of those individuals, as for so many others in Victoria, into the future. Next slide. A lot of young people reported that their mental health was worse. Many people had impacts on their sleep, and we're gregarious human beings. We need the company of others, and when we're struggling, that's when we especially need our close contacts, our loved ones' support. And so at the height of the epidemic curve in the second wave, that's when we were most isolated. We had curfews in place. We had only 4 reasons to leave home. We spent countless days isolated from others. It's one thing to have social media connection, it's another thing altogether to be able to hug someone, hold someone, and that was a burden on top of the health burden. Next slide. And it was very broad and substantial. Our diets worsened. We drank too much. We ate more junk food, and we snacked much more. So these are all kind of incremental hits to our overarching well-being. Next slide. But we have made progress. This is the Swiss cheese that I've talked about, and Ian McKay made it famous on Twitter. It's been picked up by the New York Times and really demonstrated as a systems approach to managing risk across the world. James Reason came up with it. It's been used in the airline industry. It absolutely applies systemically in the healthcare sector. All of those things that you need to have in place, because each on their own has its own limitations, but together provides really robust mitigations. Next slide. But you want to see Swiss cheese? Hotel quarantine in Victoria is Swiss cheese par excellence. There are so many mitigations that we now have in place, understanding that that's where the pointy end of risk is in Victoria, indeed in Australia. And so between testing and infection prevention and control, quarantine worker vaccination, the engineering fixes, the distancing that gets embedded, the red zones and green zones, the air purifiers that are in rooms, the specific protocols for those who have to use CPAP in their rooms, and all of those measures used together with a continuous quality improvement cycle in order to reflect on those gaps and improve them to the fullest extent that's feasible. Next slide. But there are challenges to the cheese. In having a systems approach, you have to be open to new data and new science, as I've talked about. Hubris really has no place. I'm not sure if hubris comes from ego or narcissism. I'm not sure it does. I think sometimes it's a fear of being shamed, but you need to be able to recognise where you've made mistakes or where you've had a view that needs to change, and you need to be open to changing it. So intransigence is an inappropriate response to system improvements and overarching engineered changes to how we go about things. Groupthink's a danger, and the orthodoxy, although it has its place, can also be part of that inertia to change. So, I would say if you come to a new view and it's happening by increments, but you recognise that you need to move, just move. Apologise if you think you've been too slow and it's hurt or harmed in the process of hanging on for too long. I saw an ID physician on Twitter who was apologising to the Canadian community about his views on transmission and PPE and airborne spread. And the response was fantastic. He was lauded for coming to that changed view. I think we need to recognise that you won't be shamed unless you're really hanging on inappropriately for far, far too long. So I would say always reflect, listen to the voices that are contesting your view, and throw yourself into that space of ambiguity and continual reflection, and then be open to saying, hey, I've got a new view, or I got it wrong previously, let's move forward together. Next slide. So in Victorian settings, we've done lots of work in our own reflections. Of course, there have been inquiries that are imposed, but we welcome them to the degree that we can learn through that really intensive process of inquiry and challenge. And so I welcome all of the new information that we've got through those processes. Next slide. Through trauma, and it's been particularly focused in the health sector, and for those healthcare workers who have suffered through this, I would say I wish it had all not been so. This is not to welcome trauma, but I do want to reflect on the fact that through traumatic experiences, and I'm reflecting on my own here, there are opportunities to be different and to go about things differently. It can change the way that we relate to others. That's happened in my marriage with my family. I've got a heightened sense of the preciousness of those people in my life, and I think many of us do, having gone through the lockdown in Victoria. New possibilities is another thing that's been flagged, and this is work by Richard Tedeschi, working with Army veterans and others who've had post-traumatic stress experiences, where some of them who have been facilitated, not by psychologists or psychiatrists, but by expert companions, have been able to go through a process that it has brought positive change about for them as individuals. They've seen new possibilities and they've seen their ability to be in that space. And I see that in a leadership role, the opportunities that I have as a Chief Health Officer, with significant prominence now in the Victorian community. Personal strength is another reflection I have. It's not that I think I can take on everything, but I do feel like everything that I've been through has set me up for greater opportunities to manage, really significant challenges in the future, and there will be some. Appreciation of life is another reflection that I have. I think many people experience it when there are so many deprivations that have happened through the last year and a half. And spiritual and existential change, so that meaning and purpose in life. This is an opportunity to reflect on the most important things and to take the time, if it's appropriate for you, to reset about where you want to focus your energies and your purpose in life. But the role of the expert companion is an important one. I've had them in colleagues, in my family, my wife in particular, to be able to facilitate some of this really positive change. I think you've got a role as healthcare workers, potentially for some of your colleagues, to be that expert companion to allow people to tell their story, to reflect on it, and to share in the experiences that you've had together in a positive way. Next slide. So just to end on success, we've had our donut days. We now have zero community transmission for over 70 days in Victoria. That is in no small part to the work that our health sector has done, all of you collectively, but it's been an effort of 6.7 million Victorians, and I've said it before, I couldn't be more proud of Victorians and the way that we have that communal sense. So we're moving into COVID normal. We've got the MCG being filled, and vaccination is our path out of this. It's not as fast as I'd like. Not as many people vaccinated as I would like to see for this day, because I know that the more protection that we can get, the more that we can move to a normal existence. Final reflections on the future. I think we're going to have ongoing existential challenges, so we need to ready ourselves as a health sector for all of the ways that our wellbeing might be challenged: climate change, antimicrobial resistance. There will be profound increasing uncertainty in a world that changes day to day. We're in the middle of an information technology and biotechnology revolution. We've got issues of human and planetary connectedness that have played out with this pandemic, vaccine nationalism and the way that it's impacted how we move together as a global community. And we've got reflections on how liberal democracies are challenged, how they've worked differently across the world. There are so many reflections out of the biggest crises that we've had, and I'll have an opportunity to talk about it in a moment. So thanks for listening. Terrific again to speak today, and look forward to hearing some questions. Thank you.
Boy, you covered a lot in a short period of time there. I'm going to be asking questions that our delegates have been sending through, and just to let you know, there's a prioritisation process, so people are voting on those. So we'll start with at the top. What ongoing public health measures or strategies should we retain and become used to post-COVID-19, given the climate change and globalisation, will eventually result in a future pandemic. So what are those kind of get used to strategies, if you like?
Look, I think the reflections on those system approaches are really critical. There are so many benefits from investment in public health. Preparedness for a pandemic, the response capability in a pandemic is critical. And I think that applies to all of those other existential challenges. So if you take antimicrobial resistance or climate change, prevention and embedding a prevention approach will be key. It doesn't mean that those challenges won't be present, but it means that we'll ready ourselves much more strongly and we'll be better off for it. The investments that you make now in mitigation and in that capability and capacity to respond will save you so much in the end, economically, but also in terms of how significant the challenge might be. You know, there's talk of antimicrobial resistance killing more people globally than cancer by 2050. Now, we could change that trajectory with a real focus on what we can do now, which are some basic things in infection prevention and control, and some of those engineering changes in our hospitals and in the way that we care for people with antibiotic use. So, you know, it might look like a big investment now.
Yes.
It's very small compared to what you would need to respond with 50 years hence.
Right, and we will reflect back on that for sure at some point. This is a terrific question. What are you most proud of when you think about the public health response?
I'm really proud of the way that Victorians collectively, and really with a kind of Victorian brand, pulled together to get through enormously personally challenging circumstances. We all hated lockdown. We all hated stage 4, except maybe some introverts who were delighted not to see so many people around.
Yes.
But that was amazing to see, and I know how challenging it is to get the vast majority of people to do something so significant. And so to be able to see that across an entire population and to then share in that triumph at the end, donuts and all, was really something that I'm super proud of.
Yes, rightly so, as should every Victorian, as you say. It's something that, you know, we all did together.
Indeed, and my team in the Department of Health working countless hours and with a passion and a dedication and focus to do that. Yeah,
incredible. It is amazing to travel interstate, and you know, people kind of have a very blank look when you say you're from Victoria, because they can only imagine what people achieved. Another terrific question: how hard is it to balance the many different, sometimes competing components of public health? There's a second part to that, but it's really about how do you balance those competing parts of the public health processes that we're all engaged in.
Certainly, you know, there were competing harms. There was the harm of COVID-19 and what rolling waves would mean. I knew that there were constraints on human rights and liberties, and that was a balancing act. Yeah. Ultimately, I was trying to reflect on the data, and it was there very early on from Imperial College about what it would mean if you couldn't get to zero transmission. Right. It would be waves and waves, and through each of those waves, I knew that there would be huge questions about lockdown again. Yeah. And I've seen in European countries and elsewhere, the lockdowns come, but they come too late. And you end up with a longer period and a harsher lockdown by virtue of not acting early and as robustly as you need to. And so even though it was a really tricky choice about a harsh lockdown, and for the 112 days that it was, knowing that we could have a period of 6 months where our liberties are really different. So it's absolutely a balancing act, but I think I was trying to use, you know, rational and empirical data to say this is what the future will look like if we don't make these choices now.
Yeah. Thank you for that one. This is a really popular question, actually, Brett. What are the main systemic issues that need to be adjusted, not just for COVID, but for an overall system improvement?
Oh, that...
Big question.
It's a huge question,
It's a huge
and I'm
question.
probably not the expert in this field, but I think, you know, for any huge health challenge, you need... COVID shone a particular light on weaknesses in the system and on gaps, and it's shown that it's not just in a hospital setting, but across society. And so I think for every challenge, we need to really deeply investigate where light has shone on those gaps and try and address that. It was an issue of socioeconomic inequality. It showed the genuine issues with homelessness and how at risk you were by virtue of that, what it means to be in crowded accommodation, what it means to have a family size and insecure work of a certain kind. And so all of those elements come into play, and they're not just health questions, they are questions for the whole of Victorian government, they're civil society questions. There'll be different pandemics, there'll be different existential challenges that'll show up in different ways, but I suspect that the same core elements, you know, what we often call the causes of the causes, the social determinants of health, will be at play for so many of these challenges. We need to address those, and they often relate to inequity and inequality, and I think that's a really key thing to address.
Thank you for that. Can you please talk about the effect on younger children, education and mental health? And there's another broader question about mental health and the ongoing, I guess, future challenges as well.
Yeah, look, I think we need to be really open to understanding exactly what's happened. It's clear that there have been challenges through children being at home. There's still a lot of contention around the point at which you might close schools proactively. I think the pendulum has swung to trying to keep kids in school as much as possible, understanding the wellbeing benefit of being at school. That said, you get to a threshold where the risk of transmission within schools becomes significant, but it depends on the extent to which you can bring those mitigations into school. That's masks, that's ventilation in particular. So sometimes it drives transmission to a degree, but often I think we can keep kids in school. We need to see what the short, medium and long-term effects of having missed that face-to-face learning are for kids to help inform those choices into the future. But we'll be watching that. I know the Victorian government's made an investment in some catch-up for kids, but there are broader wellbeing issues at play beyond just academic performance.
Absolutely. What still keeps you up at night?
The possibility of community transmission occurring again. You know, we've got a case we're watching in Victoria at the moment. No new cases today, folks, but you know, until we've got the protection of significant vaccination coverage, that risk is still here and it's still not insubstantial. Now we'll jump on each and every case, but new variants are more infectious. They can evade immune responses, and so I'll be on tenterhooks until everyone's vaccinated. Everyone who's eligible is vaccinated.
What does excellent quarantine look like for the state in the long term?
Oh, I think it's all those slices of Swiss cheese at their very best. Hotels are not made to ventilate easily. You know, our quarantine system has effectively negative pressure rooms across the board, but people open doors, people have welfare needs, it's a balancing act between how you look after individuals' mental health and well-being and their protection from transmission to others. So a quarantine system that is open to the open air, but also supports people's well-being in terms of how they live in a confined space for 2 weeks is really critical as well. It looks a bit like Howard Springs, but I think we can learn things about that as well. Howard Springs was not built with infection prevention and control in mind, So I think we'd have more dedicated red and green zones, but we would certainly move to a more open air environment.
This is a terrific one as well. Brett, I'll read it verbatim. Brett, thank you a million. What changes to health systems' workforce and structure of workforce do you think we need to manage? And it's just flipped off the screen, but do you think we need to manage? It's another big one, I know.
It is a big one. Look, I think the demands on our workforce continue to increase over time. I keep going back to the power of preventive and population-based health to help ease that pressure. And there will always be surge requirements. And so I think the investment in our workforce needs to take account of that. We can't all be on at full capacity all of the time. We need to allow for the ebb and flow. And I think part of that is making the longer term investment that's in a broader workforce strategy. In public health, for me, that means going beyond just public health physicians like myself to the broader public health workforce, and to be able to mobilise a public health workforce who are not engaged in this stuff day in, day out. They might be focused in other areas in academia or in research, but to be able to mobilise in a crisis response as needed. I think that applies in the acute health sector as well, that we should train and consider within a strategy the workforce that can be mobilised at times when required, so that we're not all going flat out for 16 months without pause. It needs a national workforce strategy that involves the development of people over a long, long period of time. We need to look at how health might look 20 years from now and try and take some of those coalface pressures off by investing in what population health and prevention health would mean now.
We don't have time for any more questions, though I could sit here, to be honest, we could sit here right up to lunch with the number of questions coming through. In fact, I might share some with you at a later date, because there's some wonderful reflections coming through from all of the people who are listening and attending today. As you've picked up, I'm quite an effusive person, a hugger and a kisser and a waver. So I've had to change my behaviour as well. And the only way that I know how to express the gratitude that I want to for you coming today and talking to us, and for all the work you've done, for your leadership, your passion and your commitment. I'm turned into an emoji. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Really, really appreciate
Thanks, everyone.
it. Thank you. Thanks so much. Oh, we'll be having a break of 5 minutes, so we'll see you on the other end of that.